Welcome to the deep dive. You know, Western military planners turned the pain dial up to an absolute 10 in 2026. They fully expected the adversary to just fold.
Right, because according to every Western strategic model, the math made perfect sense.
Exactly. Apply overwhelming technological force, destroy key infrastructure, and a rational actor will, calculate that the cost of continuing is simply too high.
They'll capitulate, but, well, the math completely failed.
It really did. So today we are examining the ongoing 2026 Iran war and tackling this massive strategic puzzle. Why has traditional military coercion fundamentally failed to force a resolution?
And to understand that failure, we're looking at an incredibly insightful April 2026 piece in the Global Review by Dr. Farid Novin. He's an economist and a strategic consultant.
Yeah, and what I love is that he bypasses the usual military hardware analysis entirely.
He really does. Instead, he looks at the geopolitical fallout of this conflict
Yeah.
by introducing a 1,000-year-old Persian epic poem into modern military analysis.
Which is wild. But it reveals how ignoring a civilization's foundational texts can lead to a complete misdiagnosis of their behavior. It's like sitting across from someone and assuming they're playing your game, but they're not.
Right. Standard rational thinking can completely misread a situation when you just ignore the cultural context of the person sitting across the table from you.
Okay, let's unpack this. The initial 2026 military campaign was deeply Clausewitzian. The planners operated on that classic assumption that war is merely the continuation of politics by other means.
Right, that it's a coercive instrument.
Exactly. If you establish total air superiority and dismantle infrastructure, you create immense domestic pressure. And that pressure is supposed to force the leadership to the negotiating table.
Because the objective isn't necessarily to annihilate the enemy.
No, it's to alter their political calculus. But the expectation was a swift cost-benefit realization, which, obviously didn't happen.
Not at all. The empirical trajectory of the war, documented in the article, shows the exact opposite. Facing just a technologically overwhelming bombardment, Iran simply absorbed the strikes.
They maintained their operational continuity, right, across both their military and civilian sectors.
Yeah, they did. And they categorically refused to negotiate. So that fundamental assumption that sufficient kinetic pressure would compel a political recalibration, it just completely evaporated.
It's like treating a brutal conflict as a hostile corporate takeover. Like, in a business negotiation, if a massive conglomerate aggressively buys up your shares, right?
Yeah, and undercuts your supply chain.
A rational CEO eventually just cuts their losses. They take a golden parachute and step down because everyone agrees on the underlying currency, which is profit.
But this isn't about profit.
Exactly.
Yep.
If someone kicks in your front door where your family sleeps, you aren't doing a cost-benefit analysis on the antique vase you're about to smash over the intruder's head.
No, you're not thinking about minimizing losses. You're fighting for your home.
The currency is no longer profit, it is survival.
What's fascinating here is that the adversary in this conflict is operating within entirely different conceptual boundaries of war.
How so? Like, practically speaking?
Well, when Western strategists launch a targeted strike, they view it as a communicative act. It's a loud, violent message in a bargaining process.
A very loud message.
Right. But Iranian officials, as the article notes, view this external pressure as a fundamental test of their sovereignty. They continually emphasize this concept of ezat.
Ezet, which translates to dignity or honor, right?
Yes, dignity. So to them, a bombardment is not a prompt to calculate losses and negotiate. It is an imposition that demands absolute resistance to maintain their dignity.
So looking at those differing frameworks, relying solely on standard Western theory leaves this massive analytical gap. The article even mentions Sun Tzu, right? His emphasis on deception and achieving victory without battle.
Yeah, and while that explains an adversary's desire to avoid costly conventional wars, it doesn't explain what happens once the missiles actually start flying.
Right, because Sun Tzu's philosophy still operates on a cost-benefit axis. It's just a bloodless one.
Exactly. Prevailing interpretations rely way too heavily on those two poles. Clausewitz for understanding escalation and political utility, and Sun Tzu for maneuver and indirect strategy.
But those frameworks just hit a wall here.
They do. To understand the sheer persistence of this resistance, the article argues we have to integrate a third intellectual axis. We really need to examine the cultural and civilizational war philosophy embedded deeply in Iranian history.
And that brings us to the core of this analysis, focusing on the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. This epic Persian poem, written over a millennium ago, is foundational to Iranian cultural identity.
It really is. The text integrates three core concepts into a unified strategic ontology. You have force, which is Zawar,
Okay, it's sour.
then wisdom or strategy, which is Karad, and legitimacy, which is Fart. Ferdowsi isn't merely writing historical poetry here.
Right, he is encoding a civilizational philosophy of survival.
Exactly. And the analysis focuses heavily on that second pillar, Karad, or intellectual mastery and wisdom.
Because despite the grand existential battles described throughout the Shahnameh, the text consistently privileges foresight, strategy, and intellectual mastery over brute force.
Yeah, the translation provided in the source is actually striking. Where counsel and stratagem bear fruit, it is better to use wisdom than to draw the sword.
And there's another passage that reinforces this too, advising leaders to make knowledge your heavy armor in battle. So war is clearly framed as a failure of better alternatives.
It's definitely not the ideal instrument of statecraft. It parallels those high strategic ideals of avoiding conflict, but Ferdowsi elevates it.
Elevates it how?
Well, from an operational preference to an ethical mandate. Relying on strategy and wisdom isn't just more efficient than violence, it is morally superior.
Wait, I have to push back on this logic. If their foundational cultural text so profoundly prefers wisdom, counsel, and strategy over brute force, why absorb this level of punishment?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right. I mean, to a Western observer, recognizing that you are massively outgunned and coming to the table to save your power grid and your civilian infrastructure, that seems like the ultimate application of using wisdom.
It does seem that way from our perspective.
So why isn't a strategic ceasefire their definition of karat?
That tension right there is exactly where Western planners misread the doctrine. There is a strict duality to Ferdowsi's philosophy.
A duality.
Yeah, the preference for restraint, indirect action, and asymmetric engagement, that applies fiercely before a conflict. A state must use every ounce of intellectual mastery to avoid the tragic necessity of direct, symmetrical war.
So they will calculate, deter, and maneuver to prevent a direct clash. But the moment that threshold is crossed,
The paradigm completely flips. Once direct conflict becomes unavoidable, once it is actively imposed upon them by an external force, the restraint just vanishes.
oh wow. So the calculus of avoidance is replaced by absolute, total commitment.
Exactly. The article notes that this duality, hyper-calculating restraint beforehand, and uncompromising absolutism within the conflict that defines their strategic behavior.
They do not seek a conventional war, but once they are dragged into it, the arena becomes a domain of unwavering resistance.
Right, you don't negotiate your way out of a war that has been forced upon you. You outlast it.
That shifts the entire mechanism of the conflict. It is not a dial you can just turn up and down depending on the pressure. It is a toggle switch.
A very unforgiving toggle switch.
Yeah, and once it is flipped to war, the transactional math just dissolves. The state's bureaucratic and military apparatus shifts entirely into an endurance posture.
But for a state to actually maintain that kind of absolute, unwavering commitment under overwhelming bombardment, the population can't just be following top-down orders.
Right, a government cannot merely mandate that level of endurance while the infrastructure crumbles. The people actually have to believe the suffering is necessary.
Which brings us to the moral authority needed. That leads directly to Ferdowsi's third, and perhaps most vital pillar.
Because you need more than just force and strategy to survive an onslaught.
You need a unifying moral core.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's delve into far, which the text translates as legitimacy. In the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi argues that legitimacy is the ultimate deciding factor in any existential clash.
Superseding material strength, technological superiority, even the sheer size of a military force.
Which goes against so much modern military doctrine. Western strategists are often searching for a physical center of gravity, right? Like a command bunker, a supply route, a specific weapons system.
Exactly. The idea being you destroy that physical thing and the enemy collapses. But Ferdowsi locates the center of gravity entirely within the cultural psyche.
The poem captures this perfectly. The blackness of a sprawling host will prove to be in vain. One man of war is mightier than 100,000 men.
It sounds poetic, but operationally, the strategic implication of that is massive.
How does that translate to the battlefield?
Well, the operational reality is that an army or an entire state does not collapse simply because its physical assets are destroyed. It collapses when it loses its moral claim to fight.
So when the internal legitimacy evaporates, the societal resistance crumbles.
Right. If the fighters and the populace no longer believe the cause is just, a sprawling host of 100,000 men is utterly useless.
But conversely, if the legitimacy remains intact, the individual will to fight becomes nearly unbreakable.
And looking at the 2026 campaign, you can see this playing out vividly. Official discourse has consistently framed the war not as a geopolitical chess match that they initiated, but as a purely defensive necessity.
Right. They frame the conflict as an unjust imposition by an external aggressor. By meticulously controlling that narrative, they aren't just managing public relations.
No, they are actively reinforcing their internal legitimacy. They are manufacturing far under fire.
Which creates a profound paradox for Western military coercion. The logic assumes that applying external pressure and demanding capitulation will break the adversary's will.
However, within this cultural framework, those exact actions actually feed their legitimacy.
Wow. Because by relentlessly bombing infrastructure and demanding surrender, the attacking force visually and viscerally proves the narrative.
Exactly. It proves that the war is an unjust imposition on their sovereignty.
So the coercive pressure acts as the very fuel for their moral resolve. I mean, think about how this psychological mechanism works in your own life.
Yeah, the human element of it.
Imagine a scenario where someone gives you a high-pressure ultimatum, do this or I will ruin your career. If that ultimatum attacks your core identity or your fundamental sense of justice, you rarely calculate the pragmatic benefits of complying.
No, your resolve hardens.
You will endure incredible discomfort, stress, financial loss, simply because yielding to an unjust demand feels like erasing your own identity.
And scaling that deeply human reaction up to a civilizational level explains a lot about geopolitical endurance.
It really does. When legitimacy becomes the center of gravity and the conflict is intrinsically tied to identity and dignity, the stakes transcend politics.
We have to look at what happens when the very existence of the nation is threatened by this overwhelming force. Which brings us to the ultimate consequence of this philosophy.
The doctrine of existential resistance. The article details how, in this framework, the state isn't just viewed as a political entity with legal borders drafted on a map.
No, it is viewed as Iran-Shar, a living, civilizational entity.
And in a standard Westphalian model, a nation-state can cede territory, pay reparations, sign a humiliating treaty, and still survive.
But for a civilizational entity, sovereignty is completely inseparable from cultural identity. You cannot carve it up without killing the organism.
A threat to the state morphs from a political dispute into a direct threat against the existence of the culture itself.
And the starkness of this reality is captured in a really chilling passage from the Shahnameh.
Yes, let me read it. It is a tragedy should Iran be laid to waste and transformed into a lair for leopards and lions. Let us all, as one, turn our faces toward battle and tighten the world around the malicious foe. Better that we all, man by man, give our bodies to death than surrender our nation to the enemy.
Better that we all, man by man, give our bodies to death than surrender our nation to the enemy. For Western analysts, that just reads like hyperbolic poetry.
Right, dramatic flair.
But for the strategist operating within this ontology, it is a literal strategic baseline. It means there are zero political off-ramps once the conflict is defined as existential.
So what does this all mean? When Western analysts observe Iran taking massive infrastructural hits in 2026, but steadfastly refusing to negotiate, they label it strategic inflexibility.
They diagnose the leadership as irrational or just stubbornly detached from reality.
But synthesizing Dr. Noven's findings reveals that this behavior is perfectly rational within its deeply embedded moral framework.
Absolutely.
In this cultural ontology, surrender isn't just a political loss where you lick your wounds and rebuild your economy in a decade. Surrender is equivalent to collective annihilation. It is the death of the civilizational soul.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate operational implication here is that endurance itself becomes the primary strategy.
Endurance as strategy.
Yes. The goal is not necessarily to secure a decisive, sweeping military victory in the traditional sense. Achieving that against a technologically dominant force is practically impossible.
Right, so instead, the objective is simply to outlast the bombardment.
The strategy is to outlegitimize the adversary, to survive the onslaught without yielding an inch of dignity, and by doing so, reshape the political meaning of the entire conflict.
So if they survive the bombardment without surrendering, they essentially win the moral war.
Exactly. The adversary exhausts their munitions and their international political capital, while the defending state emerges battered, sure, but ideologically victorious.
Because material superiority simply cannot compel submission when the adversary defines the conflict as an existential test of identity.
Framing negotiations as a prerequisite for stopping the bombing eliminates any viable diplomatic solution. It merely reinforces their internal narrative of righteous resistance.
Wow. Pulling all these analytical threads together, the article convincingly argues for a three-dimensional theory of war to truly comprehend this conflict.
We absolutely still need Clausewitz to understand the mechanics of escalation, the deployment of overwhelming force, and the role of political objectives in initiating strikes.
Right, and we still need Sun Tzu to understand the value of indirect maneuver, deception, and the foundational desire to avoid unnecessary conflict.
But to grasp the reality of the 2026 Iran war, Ferdowsi is required reading.
He really is.
Ferdowsi provides the crucial missing dimension. He explains the mechanics of endurance. He illuminates the vital role of legitimacy, the far, as the true center of gravity.
And he provides the logical framework for the absolute, categorical refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming material destruction.
Together, these thinkers reveal that what we are witnessing is not just a contest of military capabilities. It's a profound clash of strategic cultures. It's a collision of fundamentally different ontologies of war.
Now, we want to be very clear here. Looking at this purely through an analytical lens, this text exposes a massive conceptual blind spot. We aren't endorsing any specific political side of this war. Our goal is to report on Dr. Noven's findings impartially.
Right. The key takeaway is that expecting rapid capitulation from an adversary is a conceptually flawed strategy if you fundamentally misunderstand their cultural framework.
Rationality is not a universal mathematical equation that applies identically across the globe. Rationality is deeply culturally conditioned.
This raises an important question. The implications of this analysis extend far beyond the borders of this specific 2026 conflict. If our modern frameworks for conflict resolution, whether economic sanctions, diplomatic ultimatums, or kinetic military coercion, if they rely entirely on a transactional cost-benefit view of rationality, how many other geopolitical conflicts are we fundamentally misdiagnosing?
That is a terrifying thought.
Are we constantly caught off guard by the actions of state adversaries simply because we haven't bothered to read the foundational cultural texts that shape their worldview?
It is a staggering realization for you to think about. Imagine trying to win a highly structured game of chess, assuming every move is about controlling the center of the board and capturing pieces for a point advantage.
Sounds perfectly logical.
Right. But the person sitting across from you is playing a completely different survival game, where the objective isn't to score points, but to ensure the board itself doesn't burn down.
Yeah, you are going to be very confused when your brilliant checkmate goes completely ignored.
You cannot strategize effectively, let alone find a path to peace, if you don't even know what game is being played. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the frameworks you use to view the world, and we will catch you next time.